the sound of 50 silk gowns falling to the cold marble floor. It is October 30th, 1501. You are trapped inside the Vatican, but this is no mass. Around you, cardinals cover their mouths, not in prayer, but in shock. On the ground, 50 naked women crawl on their hands and knees, hunting for chestnuts scattered by the Pope himself. He is laughing. But look at the bride. She sits frozen, staring at a bedroom door that has no locks. She knows that before the sun rises, she will be forced to consummate her marriage 3 times while these men watch. This is the Banquet of Chestnuts, the night the church turned into a theater of hell. Stay with me. We are about to expose the truth they tried to burn. If this story grips you, drop a like. It takes a second and helps us give a voice to the forgotten. The October sun hung low over the eternal city, casting a light that was too heavy, too gold, like molten metal poured over a graveyard. Rome in 1501 did not smell of sanctity. It smelled of the Tiber's mud, unwashed bodies, and the cloying, suffocating scent of incense burned to mask the rot beneath. To the pilgrims falling to their knees in the dirt, this was the threshold of heaven. To the man riding through the Porta del Popolo, it was the open mouth of a beast. Alfonso d'Este, the 25-year-old heir to the Duchy of Ferrara, sat atop his white stallion with the rigid posture of a man facing a firing squad. He was handsome in the way of northern Italian nobility, with sharp features and dark, intelligent eyes that were currently wide with a terror he fought to suppress. His velvet doublet, embroidered with the silver eagle of his house, felt less like finery and more like a shroud. The crowds cheered as he passed. They threw flowers that landed in the horse manure paving the streets. "Long live the groom! Long live the alliance!" they shouted. Alfonso did not wave. His gloved hands gripped the reins so tightly that the leather groaned. He knew what these people were really cheering for. They were not cheering for a wedding. They were cheering for the fresh meat arriving at the Colosseum. As the procession wound its way toward the Vatican, the massive shadow of the Castel Sant'Angelo fell over them. Alfonso looked up, his gaze drawn irresistibly toward the apostolic palace, rising like a cliff face against the darkening sky. There, at a high-arched window, stood a figure. It was a woman. Even from this distance, the setting sun caught the famous hair of Lucrezia Borgia, spinning it into a halo of unnatural brightness. She was the most beautiful woman in Christendom, or so the poets claimed. She was 21 years old, draped in silk that cost more than a peasant's lifetime of labor. Yet she did not lean out to wave to her future husband. She did not smile. She stood motionless, like a statue carved from grief. Alfonso watched, transfixed, as her hand slowly rose to her throat. She rubbed the skin there, a repetitive, unconscious motion. It was a nervous tick, a phantom memory. Alfonso felt a chill slice through the humid air. He knew what she was remembering. She was remembering the night her brother's men had strangled her second husband in his bed while she screamed in the next room. She wasn't looking at a bridegroom. She was looking at the next ghost. He tore his eyes away, bile rising in his throat. "Father, why have you done this?" he thought, the bitterness tasting like copper. For weeks, Alfonso had written letters to his father, the Duke of Ferrara. He had begged. He had pleaded. He had offered to renounce his inheritance, to become a monk, to vanish into exile. "Do not send me to them," he had written. "The Borgias do not marry, they consume." But the reply from Ferrara had been cold and pragmatic. The armies of the Pope were on their borders. If Alfonso did not marry the Pope's daughter, Ferrara would burn. He had been sold. He was the blood price for his city's safety. The procession crossed the bridge. The Vatican loomed ahead. It was not a house of God. It was a military fortress disguised with frescoes and marble. The Swiss guards stood at attention, their halberds gleaming. They were massive men, resplendent in their yellow, blue, and red uniforms, but there was no holiness in their faces. Their eyes were cold, assessing Alfonso not as a guest, but as a potential threat to be neutralized. These men did not guard the faith. They guarded the crime family that had hijacked the throne of St. Peter. Alfonso dismounted. His legs felt like water, but centuries of breeding forced him to stand tall. He was led through corridors that echoed with whispers, past cardinals who bowed too low, their smiles sharp and knowing. They knew. Everyone knew. Finally, the great doors of the Sala Regia were thrown open. The smell of perfume was overwhelming, thick enough to choke on. At the far end of the hall sat Pope Alexander VI. Rodrigo Borgia was 69 years old, a mountain of a man. His flesh spilled over his vestments, his face flushed with the vitality of a man who devoured life with both hands. He radiated power like a furnace radiates heat. "My son!" The Pope's voice boomed, jovial and terrifying. He spread his arms wide, a gesture that looked less like an embrace and more like a net being cast. Alfonso knelt, kissing the heavy emerald ring on the Pope's hand, but his skin crawled. He could feel eyes on him, not the Pope's eyes, something sharper, something deadlier. He looked up and to the right. Standing in the shadow of the papal throne was a young man. He wore black velvet, simple compared to the Pope's gold, but he sucked all the air out of the room. Cesare Borgia, the Duke of Valentinois. He was 26 with a face that could have belonged to a fallen angel, beautiful, dark, and utterly devoid of mercy. Cesare did not speak. He did not welcome his new brother-in-law. He simply stood there, one hand resting casually on the hilt of his sword, the other toying with a heavy gold chain around his neck. And then he smiled. It was not a smile of greeting. It was a faint curling of the lips, amused and predatory. It was the smile of a cat that has just seen a mouse scurry into a corner from which there is no exit. Cesare's eyes scanned Alfonso's neck, the very spot Lucrezia had touched on her own throat moments ago. In that silence, amidst the gold and the incense and the power of Rome, the truth crashed down on Alfonso with the weight of a tombstone. The wedding was a lie. The alliance was a lie. He was not a husband. He was merely livestock, kept alive only as long as he was useful, fattened up for the slaughter that was sure to come. The air in the papal chapel was not air. It was a soup of frankincense and body heat, thick enough to coat the inside of a man's lungs. Hundreds of candles flickered in the draught, casting long dancing shadows against the frescoed walls where painted saints looked down in silent judgment. But tonight, the saints were the only holy things in the room. Alfonso stood at the altar, his knees locked to keep them from trembling. He felt small, diminished by the crushing opulence of the Vatican. To his left stood the cardinals, a sea of scarlet silk. They were old men mostly, with faces like melted wax and eyes that darted with the sharp intelligence of vipers. They did not look like men of God. They looked like conspirators at a murder trial. A hush fell over the room, heavy and sudden. Lucrezia Borgia entered. She did not walk. She glided, propelled by a mechanism of duty rather than will. Her gown was a fortress of gold silk, stiff with embroidery, so heavy it hissed against the marble floor. Ropes of pearls were woven into her blonde hair, gleaming like captured moonlight, and a necklace of rubies lay against her throat, red stones resting on skin so pale it looked translucent. She was breathtaking. She was the most beautiful trophy in Europe. But as she reached the altar and turned to face Alfonso, the breath died in his throat. He looked into her eyes. They were not sad. Sadness implies a connection to the world, a desire for things to be different. Her eyes were vacant. They were clear, blue, and utterly empty, like shards of glass sweeping up from a broken window. They reflected the candlelight, the gold, and Alfonso's own terrified face, but they held nothing behind them. It was the gaze of a woman who had learned that the only way to survive the fire was to turn herself into stone. Standing between them, officiating the ceremony himself, was Pope Alexander VI. It was a supreme act of blasphemy. The Vicar of Christ, the bridge between humanity and God, was acting as the auctioneer for his own flesh and blood. He wore the sacred vestments, the heavy mitre upon his head, but his expression was that of a merchant concluding a particularly profitable transaction. He looked at Lucrezia not with a father's love, but with an owner's pride. "Dearly beloved," the Pope's voice boomed, rolling off the vaulted ceiling. "We are gathered here to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The words felt slimy. Alfonso could hear the low murmur of the cardinals behind him. They were not praying. "Third time's the charm," one whispered, a soft sibilant hiss. "Look at the hips on her," another muttered, the sound barely audible over the choir. "She's built for breeding, if she doesn't get strangled first." Laughter, soft and stifled, rippled through the scarlet ranks. It was a sound disguised as coughing, masked by the rustle of silk. They were gambling on his life. Alfonso could feel their bets landing on his shoulders. 6 months? A year? Before the Borgias tire of him? "Do you, Alfonso d'Este, take this woman to be your wedded wife?" Alfonso opened his mouth. His tongue felt like a piece of dry leather. He looked past the Pope, toward the side of the room where Cesare Borgia stood, leaning against a pillar, watching with that same faint, terrifying smile. "I do," Alfonso said. His voice cracked. It was a weak, pathetic sound that shamed him. The Pope turned to his daughter. "And do you, Lucrezia, take this man?" Lucrezia did not blink. She did not look at her father. She stared straight ahead through Alfonso, focusing on some invisible point in the distance. "I do," she said. Her voice was flat. It had no tremor, no emotion, no cadence. It was the sound of a dead lake where no wind blows. It was the voice of a ghost haunting her own body. "The rings?" the Pope commanded, unable to keep the eagerness out of his tone. A page boy stepped forward with a velvet pillow. On it lay 2 bands of heavy gold. Alfonso picked up the smaller one. His hand shook so violently he almost dropped it. He reached out and took Lucrezia's hand. Her skin was ice. It was a shocking, physical jolt. In the stifling heat of the chapel, surrounded by hundreds of sweating bodies and burning candles, her hand was as cold as a corpse pulled from a winter river. It was the coldness of someone whose blood had stopped flowing out of sheer dread. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, another shackle to bind her to the tragedy of her name. He looked up, panic flaring in his chest. He wanted to run. He wanted to drop her hand and sprint through the heavy doors, to ride his horse until its heart burst, to get away from this golden tomb. His eyes widened, pleading with her, a silent scream for help. And then he felt it. Lucrezia's fingers, cold and lifeless a moment ago, tightened around his hand. It was a squeeze, a sharp, deliberate pressure. It lasted less than a heartbeat, imperceptible to the Pope, invisible to Cesare, unknown to the leering cardinals. Lucrezia's face remained a mask of porcelain indifference. Her broken glass eyes did not flicker, but the message traveled from her cold skin to his, distinct and terrifyingly clear. "Stop shaking," the squeeze said. "Do not show them your fear. They feed on it." And beneath that, a darker warning echoed in his mind, carried by the pressure of her fingers. "Do not waste your terror on this little prince. The wedding is just a performance. The real horror has not even begun." The Pope raised his hands in a benediction that felt like a curse. "I now pronounce you man and wife. What God has joined, let no man put asunder. The room erupted in applause. The cardinals clapped their soft, pampered hands. Cesare pushed himself off the pillar, his smile widening. But Alfonso stood frozen, anchored only by the cold, iron grip of the woman who had just become his wife and his fellow prisoner. The transition from the chapel to the private apartments of the Borgia was a descent from purgatory into a very specific circle of hell, one upholstered in velvet. The wedding feast was laid out in the Sala dei Santi, the room of the saints. It was a cruel joke of a setting. Above them, the frescoes of Pinturicchio depicted scenes from the lives of martyrs and holy virgins. Below, on the long tables that stretched the length of the hall, the scene was one of gluttonous excess that would have made a Roman emperor blush. Servants moved like shadows, placing dishes of grotesque luxury before the guests. There were peacocks roasted whole, their iridescent tail feathers reattached and fanned out in a mockery of life, their beaks gilded with real gold. There were mountains of pheasant, rivers of eel marinated in wine, and towers of marzipan shaped like the Castel Sant'Angelo. And there were chestnuts. They sat in heavy silver bowls at the center of every table, roasted, gleaming, dark brown, and harmless. For now they were just food, just a garnish for the winter season. Alfonso d'Este picked one up, his fingers still numb from the coldness of his wife's hand. He rolled the nut between his thumb and forefinger, feeling its hard, smooth shell, unaware that this small, simple object would soon become the instrument of his undoing. "Eat, my son," Pope Alexander VI bellowed from the head table. The Pope had already loosened his heavy robes. His face was flushed a deep, unhealthy crimson, the color of the wine that spilled from his goblet onto the pristine tablecloth. "To marriage, to the union of Rome and Ferrara." Music played, a lute and a viol weaving a melody that was sweet, melancholic, and utterly at odds with the tension vibrating in the room. Then came the sound that stopped Alfonso's heart. Thud. Click. It came from the main entrance. The heavy oak doors, carved with papal insignias, had been swung shut. The iron bolts were driven home with a finality that echoed off the painted ceiling. Alfonso turned. 4 Swiss guards stood before the doors, their halberds crossed. They weren't keeping intruders out. They were keeping the guests in. At a signal from Cesare Borgia, a side door opened. The air in the room shifted, charged with a sudden electric current of lust and confusion. The women entered. There were 50 of them. These were not the common streetwalkers of the Tiber banks. These were the courtigiani onesti, the honest courtesans of Rome. They were women of education and grace, dressed in gowns of crimson damask and emerald velvet that rivaled the attire of the noble women present. They wore jewels given to them by bishops and bankers. They moved with the practiced elegance of women who knew their worth was high. Among them was Fiammetta. She was 19, with hair the color of dark honey and eyes that usually sparkled with a sharp, cynical wit. She wore a gown of deep blue, the bodice laced with silver thread. Fiammetta was a favorite of the Roman Curia. She could quote Virgil, play the lute, and keep a cardinal's secrets. She had been summoned to the Vatican for a special performance, told it would be an evening of poetry and dance. But as she stepped into the Sala dei Santi, Fiammetta's wit deserted her. She saw the crossed halberds. She saw the locked doors. She smelled the heavy, predatory scent of men who had drunk too much power. Her eyes darted desperately around the room, seeking an anchor. She found one. Seated near the Pope was Cardinal Grimani, a man who had visited her apartments only 3 nights ago. A man who had wept in her arms and sworn he loved her more than his vows. "Eminence," she whispered, taking a step toward him, her hand raising in a subtle plea. Cardinal Grimani looked up. He saw her. For a second, recognition flashed in his eyes, a memory of intimacy. But then, he saw Cesare Borgia watching him. The cardinal's face went blank. He turned his head slowly, deliberately, picking up his wine cup and engaging the man next to him in conversation. He did not know her. To acknowledge her now, in this room, was dangerous. Fiammetta felt the blood drain from her face. She stopped moving. The 50 women huddled together in the center of the room, a cluster of terrified birds surrounded by wolves. They realized, collectively, that their silk dresses and expensive jewels were no armor here. At the head table, Lucrezia sat like a wax doll. She did not look at the women. She stared at the silver bowl of chestnuts in front of her. She picked one up, her fingernail digging into the shell until it cracked. She knew what was coming. She had seen her father's games before. Cesare Borgia sat to her right. He had not touched his food. His plate was clean. His wine cup was full but untouched. In a room of drunken revelry, his sobriety was the most terrifying thing of all. He sat in absolute stillness, his dark eyes moving from Alfonso's pale face to Fiammetta's trembling shoulders. He was the conductor of this orchestra, waiting for the crescendo. The music died away. The chatter faded into an uneasy silence. Pope Alexander VI pushed his chair back. The legs scraped loudly against the marble floor, a harsh sound that made half the guests flinch. He stood up, swaying slightly. The candlelight caught the sweat on his forehead and the madness in his eyes. He raised his goblet high, splashing wine onto the floor. "We have feasted," he roared, his voice thick with intoxication. "We have prayed. But Rome is not a city of prayers tonight. Rome is a city of truth." He swept his arm toward the center of the room, pointing a thick finger at Fiammetta and the 50 women huddled in their finery. "You think you know these women?" The Pope laughed, a wet, guttural sound. "You think you know what lies beneath the silk and the velvet? Tonight we strip away the lies. Tonight we see what nature intended." He leaned forward, his grin widening to reveal teeth stained purple with wine. "Gentlemen," he whispered, though his whisper carried to the back of the hall. "The real entertainment begins now." At his words, the Swiss guards took a step forward, their boots slamming in unison against the stone. The 50 women, the pride of Rome's nightlife, took a collective step back, their eyes wide with a primal terror. Fiammetta clutched the fabric of her blue dress. She looked at the Pope, then at the silent, watching Cesare, and finally at the locked doors. There was no poetry tonight. There was only the cage. The command was not spoken. It was barked, a raw order that stripped the room of its last pretense of civility. "Strip!" the captain of the guard shouted, his hand resting on his sword hilt. For a heartbeat, there was defiance. These were women of influence, women who whispered in the ears of bishops and bankers. But then a guard stepped forward and seized the bodice of a woman in emerald velvet, a countess's favorite. The sound of tearing fabric was louder than a scream. It ripped through the heavy air, violent and final. The defiance broke. One by one, the gowns fell. Crimson damask, midnight blue silk, gold-threaded brocade. They puddles on the floor like the molted skins of colorful birds. Underneath, the women were trembling, their skin goose-fleshed in the drafty hall. They stood exposed, hugging their own arms, trying to cover themselves with hands that were suddenly too small to hide their shame. The Pope watched, his breathing heavy, his eyes glittering with a wet, feverish light. He did not see women. He saw livestock. He saw a spectacle he had purchased with the coin of St. Peter. "Now," Alexander VI grunted, grabbing a heavy silver bowl from the table. "Feed them." He upended the bowl. Clatter, clack, thud. Hundreds of roasted chestnuts hit the marble floor. They rolled and bounced, scattering into the corners, under the tables, and around the bare feet of the women. Servants appeared from the shadows with bushels more. They cast them out in wide arcs. It sounded like a hailstorm hitting a tin roof, a cacophony of hard shells striking stone. The floor was carpeted in them, brown, hard, and mocking. "On your knees!" the Pope roared, laughing so hard he spilled wine down his chin. "Collect them. The one who gathers the most wins a prize: silk, gold, everything you desire." The women hesitated. To kneel was to surrender the last shred of their humanity. To kneel was to become the animal. Cesare Borgia, still seated, still silent, leaned forward slightly. He picked up a single chestnut from the table and flicked it toward Fiammetta. It hit her bare thigh with a sharp sting. He raised an eyebrow. The threat was clear: crawl or die. Fiammetta sank to her knees. The cold of the marble bit into her skin instantly. It was a shock that traveled up her spine, freezing her breath. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and grabbed a chestnut. Then another. Around her, 49 other women descended. The Sala dei Santi, painted with the miracles of saints, became a barnyard. The sound of weeping was drowned out by the scraping of skin against stone, the frantic scrabbling of nails on the floor. "Faster!" the cardinal shouted. Some had stood up, caught in the frenzy. They threw chestnuts harder, aiming for the women's backs, aiming to make them crawl further, stretch longer. They jeered and pointed, their faces twisted into masks of grotesque amusement. Fiammetta crawled. Her knees, unaccustomed to such abuse, began to bruise, turning purple and raw. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of noise and madness. She scrambled under a table to retrieve a nut, and a heavy boot kicked it away just as she reached for it. She looked up to see a bishop laughing down at her. She had to get out. She had to find a sanctuary. She saw the dais. It was raised above the chaos, an island of gold velvet where the Borgia family sat. Lucrezia was there, the Pope's daughter, a woman. Surely, a woman would understand this hell. Surely, a woman could not watch this and feel nothing. Fiammetta crawled toward the throne. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She pushed past another weeping girl, her eyes fixed on the hem of Lucrezia's golden gown, which trailed down the steps of the dais. She reached the bottom step. She was close enough to smell the lavender water Lucrezia used, close enough to see the stitching on her shoes. In a spasm of desperation, Fiammetta reached out. Her hand, dirty from the floor and shaking with terror, brushed against the heavy gold silk of Lucrezia's dress. She grasped the hem, clutching it like a drowning sailor clutches a rope. "Help me!" Fiammetta mouthed. No sound came out, but the shape of the words was a prayer. Lucrezia jumped. The touch was electric. For hours, Lucrezia had been a statue, a ghost in her own body. But the physical sensation of another woman's hand, warm, trembling, terrified, shattered her dissociation. She looked down. She saw Fiammetta. She saw the bruises on her knees. She saw the sheer animal terror in her eyes. And for a fraction of a second, the mask cracked. Lucrezia's hand twitched. Her fingers uncurled from the armrest. She leaned forward, her instinct screaming to reach down, to pull this woman up, to cover her, to scream at her father to stop. She started to reach out. Then she felt it. A coldness that had nothing to do with the draft. She looked to her right. Cesare was watching her. He wasn't looking at the naked women. He wasn't looking at the chestnuts. He was looking only at his sister. His face was perfectly still, but his eyes were black pits of warning. "Touch her," his gaze said, "and you join her. Save her, and you destroy yourself." The air between them solidified into a wall of iron. Lucrezia froze. Her hand, hovering inches from Fiammetta's, stopped. The compassion in her chest was strangled by the survival instinct that had been beaten into her since childhood. Slowly, agonizingly, Lucrezia pulled her hand back. She sat up straight. She smoothed the silk of her dress, pulling the hem out of Fiammetta's desperate grip. She turned her face away. Fiammetta gasped. The rejection was more painful than the bruises. She stared at the empty space where Lucrezia's hand had been. The hope in her eyes flickered, dimmed, and then went out entirely, replaced by an abyss of absolute despair. She let go of the dress. She lowered her head. She turned back to the floor, back to the chestnuts, back to the cold stone. Lucrezia stared at the fresco on the far wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She realized then, with a nausea that roiled in her gut, that she was no longer just a victim. She had made a choice. By doing nothing, by pulling her hand away, she had become one of them. Her silence was now a weapon, and she had just used it to strike the final blow. The silence that followed the madness was worse than the noise. The chestnuts had been gathered. The prizes, paltry lengths of silk and cheap trinkets, had been tossed to the weeping women like scraps to beggars. The 50 courtesans, including Fiammetta, had retreated to the edges of the room, huddling in the shadows of the tapestries, pulling their torn dresses around their bruised bodies. They wanted to leave. They prayed to be dismissed, but the doors remained bolted. The air in the Sala dei Santi was stale, heavy with the smell of spilled wine, sweat, and the lingering acrid scent of fear. The candles had burned low, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to claw at the walls. Pope Alexander VI remained on his throne. The exertion of the game had left him breathless, his face a map of broken veins and sweat. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on the bride and groom. "The entertainment is finished," the Pope announced. His voice was no longer the roar of a drunken reveler. It was the cold, iron gavel of the Supreme Pontiff. Now, the holy duty must be performed. Alfonso d'Este sat frozen. He had watched the spectacle of the chestnuts with his head bowed, trying to preserve a shred of dignity by refusing to witness it. He thought the nightmare was over. He thought he would be allowed to take his wife, retreat to a private chamber, and lock the door against this madness. He was wrong. "The marriage," the Pope continued, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated with absolute authority, "is a contract. And a contract is nothing until it is signed in blood and flesh. We will not have the annulments of the past. We will not have rumors of impotence. Tonight Rome will see. Tonight the world will know that the Borgia blood has truly mixed with the Este line." He pointed a thick finger toward the adjoining chamber. The doors to the side room had been thrown wide open. It was a space usually reserved for receiving ambassadors, now hastily converted into a bedchamber. A large bed, draped in crimson silk, had been positioned in the center. But there were no doors to close. The heavy velvet curtains had been tied back with gold cords. The line of sight from the banquet hall to the bed was direct, unobstructed, and intentional. "Go," the Pope commanded. Alfonso stood up. His legs felt like lead. He was a prince of Ferrara, raised on the chivalric codes of honor, taught that intimacy was a sacred, private act between husband and wife. To be ordered to perform like a breeding stallion in a paddock, it was a violence that didn't need a blade to kill. His face drained of all color, turning the waxen gray of old bone. He looked at the cardinals, men of the church, men of God. Surely one of them would object. Surely Cardinal Grimani or the others would say this went too far. But the cardinals merely refilled their wine cups. They shifted in their chairs to get a better view. They were the witnesses. Under the twisted canon law of the Borgias, their voyeurism was a legal necessity. The consummation had to be proven irrevocable. Alfonso looked at Cesare. The Duke of Valentinois had risen from his seat. He walked slowly toward the couple, his boots clicking rhythmically on the stone floor. He stopped in front of Alfonso. The height difference was negligible, but Cesare seemed to tower over the prince, his presence swallowing the light. Cesare's hand moved to his belt. With a slow, metallic hiss that cut through the silence, he drew his sword. It wasn't a threat of immediate death. It was a symbol of total control. He held the blade loosely, the tip resting on the marble floor between Alfonso's feet. "Do you understand the law, brother?" Cesare asked softly. His voice was cultured, smooth, and terrifying. "If you fail tonight, you return to Ferrara in a coffin. If you succeed, you bind your father's armies to ours forever." Alfonso swallowed. "I understand," he whispered. "Good," Cesare said. He raised the sword, pointing it toward the open bedchamber. "But once is not enough. Rumors are stubborn things. We must be thorough." Cesare turned to the room, raising his voice so every guard, every courtesan, and every cardinal could hear. "3 times, Cesare declared. "The marriage must be consummated 3 times before sunrise. Only then will the union be sealed beyond the reach of any lawyer or king." 3 times. The number hung in the air like a sentence. It transformed the act from a duty into a marathon of humiliation. It demanded a virility that fear had already strangled. Alfonso looked at Lucrezia. She had risen from her chair. She stood beside him, still as a statue. She did not look at the bed. She did not look at the open doors. She did not look at the 50 weeping women or the leering pope. Her eyes were fixed on a point far above the room, perhaps on the painted ceiling where the saints were being martyred. The color had left her cheeks. Her breathing was shallow and rhythmic. She was doing it again. The retreat. Alfonso watched as the person named Lucrezia seemed to fold inward, leaving only a shell behind. The woman who had squeezed his hand in the chapel was gone. The woman who had almost reached out to Fiammetta was gone. In her place was a vessel, an object to be used, a piece of furniture in her father's house. "Come, husband," Lucrezia said. Her voice was unrecognizable. It wasn't the voice of a bride. It was the voice of a prisoner walking to the gallows, urging the executioner not to delay. She turned and walked toward the open chamber, her golden train dragging over the chestnut shells that littered the floor. The sound was a dry rattle, like bones grinding together. Alfonso looked back one last time. He saw the Pope leaning forward, eyes wide with anticipation. He saw Cesare sheathing his sword with a satisfied click. There was no escape. The walls were stone. The guards were Swiss. The law was Borgia. Alfonso stepped over the threshold into the open room, and the invisible cage clicked shut behind him. The deed was done, but the nightmare had only just begun. When Alfonso d'Este finally pulled away, he did not look like a lover, nor even a husband. He looked like a man who had just survived a shipwreck, washing up on a shore he did not recognize, shivering and broken. He sat on the edge of the bed, his back to Lucrezia, his head buried in his hands. His naked back heaved with breaths that were too shallow, too fast, the hyperventilation of panic fighting against shame. Lucrezia lay still. She had not moved since the moment she had laid down. She was a figure carved from marble, pale against the crimson sheets. Her eyes were wide open, fixed on the ceiling of the makeshift bedchamber. There, in the plaster, was a crack, a long, jagged fissure that ran through the painted robe of a cherub. Lucrezia focused on it with the intensity of a scholar deciphering a dead language. If she looked at the crack hard enough, she reasoned, the rest of the room would cease to exist. If she studied the way the paint peeled at the edges, revealing the gray stone beneath, she would not have to see the open doorway. She would not have to see the cardinals watching. Then, boots clicked on the stone floor. Cesare Borgia entered the room. He did not knock. He did not hesitate. He walked to the bedside with the brisk efficiency of a physician making rounds in a plague ward. Alfonso flinched at the sound of his approach, scrambling to cover himself, but Cesare ignored him. The Duke's eyes were cold, assessing, devoid of any human warmth. He looked at the bed, he looked at the sheets, he looked at his sister, not with concern but with scrutiny. "The first seal is set," Cesare announced, his voice carrying clearly to the listeners in the outer hall. He nodded, satisfied, as if he had just inspected a shipment of grain rather than his sister's body. He turned to Alfonso, who was trembling violently now. "1 hour," Cesare said, holding up a single gloved finger. "We must follow the physician's advice to ensure potency. You will rest for 1 hour. Then, we begin again." He turned on his heel and walked out, signaling for a servant to bring fresh wine. "Mark the time," he ordered the guards. 1 hour. It was a sentence worse than the act itself. The act was violence, but the weight was torture. The room settled into a heavy, suffocating stillness. The guests in the outer hall had quieted down, their drunken energy spent, replaced by a morbid, voyeuristic lethargy. They sat in their chairs, watching the open doorway, waiting for the next act of the play. In the bedchamber, the silence began to stretch, tight and thin as a wire. Lucrezia returned to her crack in the ceiling, but as the seconds ticked by, her mind began to drift. She was not here. She was not in the Vatican. She was in the garden of the convent of San Sisto, where she had hidden as a girl. "The air is cool there," she told herself. "It smells of lemon trees and damp earth. The walls are high, and no one can see over them. I am sitting by the fountain. The water is clear. If I put my hand in, it will be cold." In her mind, the jagged crack in the ceiling transformed. It became a vine of ivy, twisting and curling in the sunlight. The crimson canopy of the bed became the shade of a cypress tree. She was floating, drifting, untethered from the body that lay exposed on the mattress. This body was just a shell, a husk left behind while the real Lucrezia slept in the grass. Tap. The sound was sharp, sudden, intruding on her garden. Lucrezia blinked. The garden flickered. Tap. Sss. It was a candle standing on a bronze stand near the bed. The wax was melting, dripping down the side, hitting the metal plate below. In the unnatural silence of the room, each drop sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. Tap. Time was leaking away, drop by hot drop. Next to her, Alfonso shifted. The mattress creaked. He was trying to be still, trying to disappear, but his body betrayed him. His breathing was ragged, a harsh, wet sound in his throat. It was the sound of a man swallowing bile, swallowing screams. Every inhalation was a struggle against the weight of the air in the room. Lucrezia wanted to tell him to stop breathing. The sound was too human, too real. It anchored her here. It pulled her back from the lemon trees. "Be quiet," she screamed in her head. "Let me go back to the garden." But then came the third sound, the one that shattered the garden forever. It came from the outer hall, drifting through the open doorway, past the guards, past the watching cardinals. It was a soft, rhythmic hitching, a stifled sob. It was Fiammetta. The courtesan was somewhere out there, huddled in the corner where she had been discarded. She was trying to be quiet. She knew the penalty for disrupting the Pope's pleasure, but the terror was too great to contain. It leaked out of her in small, broken gasps. The sound was faint, barely a whisper, but to Lucrezia it was deafening. It was a mirror in sound. Fiammetta was weeping for herself, but she was also weeping for Lucrezia. The two of them, the princess in the bed and the whore on the floor, were linked by that thread of sorrow. The contrast tore at Lucrezia's sanity. Inside the room, the silence of the grave, broken only by the tap-tap-tap of the wax and the rasp of Alfonso's shame. Outside, the low, mournful keen of a woman who had been stripped of everything. It was a symphony of the damned. Lucrezia closed her eyes tight. She tried to summon the lemon trees again, but they were gone. The ivy had withered. The fountain had run dry. There was no escape. The sounds drilled into her skull. Tap. She felt a scream building in her chest, a primal thing that wanted to tear its way out and shatter the glass, the ceiling, the world. But she swallowed it. She swallowed it down until it sat like a stone in her stomach, heavy and cold. 15 minutes, a guard called out from the darkness. Alfonso shuddered. The bed frame shook. Lucrezia opened her eyes. The crack in the ceiling was just a crack again. The paint was peeling. The stone was gray. She lay still, listening to the wax count down the seconds of her life, waiting for the hour to strike, waiting for the monster to return. The sun did not rise over the Vatican. It merely bled into the sky. A sickly, gray light filtered through the high-arched windows of the Borgia apartments, touching the wreckage of the night with cold indifference. It washed over the spilled wine that had dried into sticky purple pools on the marble. It illuminated the mountains of chestnut shells, scattered like the bones of small animals after a feast. In the adjoining chamber, the third act was finished. There was no fanfare. There was no applause from the cardinals in the outer hall. Most of the princes of the church had succumbed to the wine and the hours. They slumped in their velvet chairs, mouths open, snoring softly, their red robes pooling around them like puddles of blood. They looked small in the daylight, stripped of their nocturnal menace, reduced to old men sleeping in a room that smelled of stale vice. Alfonso d'Este sat on the edge of the bed. He was fully dressed now, though his fingers had fumbled so badly with the laces of his doublet that a servant had to step in to finish it. He stared at the floor, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Something essential had broken inside him. It wasn't just his pride. It was the fundamental belief that he was a man of agency. He realized, with a clarity that was more painful than the night's humiliations, that he would never speak of this. He would carry this silence back to Ferrara. He would let it rot in his gut. He would look at his wife and see only the witness to his destruction. He was alive, but he was not the man who had ridden through the gates of Rome yesterday. That man had died in this bed. Cesare Borgia stood by the window, looking out at the waking city. He looked remarkably fresh, as if he had fed on the energy the others had lost. He turned, his silhouette sharp against the morning light. "It is finished," Cesare said. He did not raise his voice, but the words cut through the room. "The marriage is sealed," he continued, walking over to the table where a scribe had been fastidiously recording the times. Cesare glanced at the parchment, nodded, and then looked at Alfonso. "You may return to your apartments, brother. Sleep well. You have done Rome a great service." It was a dismissal. The tool had served its purpose and could now be put back in the box. Alfonso stood up. He swayed slightly. Without a word to Cesare, without a glance at Lucrezia, he walked out. He moved like a ghost, stepping carefully over the sleeping form of a bishop, and disappeared into the hallway. Lucrezia remained. She sat on the edge of the crimson bed, her hands resting in her lap. The morning light hit her face, revealing the dark circles under her eyes. But she did not look broken. She looked hollowed out, scraped, clean. Slowly, she stood up. Her legs felt heavy, but they held her. She walked to the basin of water in the corner and washed her face. The water was cold. It shocked her skin, washing away the sweat and the tears she had refused to shed. She turned to the mirror that hung on the wall. It was a polished silver disc, framed in gold. She looked at the reflection. The woman staring back at her was Lucrezia Borgia, and yet She was a stranger. The girl who had trembled in the chapel was gone. The girl who had imagined lemon trees to escape the pain was gone. The woman in the mirror had eyes like flint, hard, gray, and capable of striking sparks. She began to dress. She refused the help of the maid who had been dozing in the corner. Lucrezia pulled the laces of her bodice tight, binding herself into her armor of silk and gold. She smoothed her hair. She adjusted her necklace. She turned to leave. To exit the room, she had to walk through the banquet hall. She had to walk through the scene of the crime. Lucrezia stepped over the threshold. The room was a graveyard of dignity. She saw the sleeping cardinals. She saw the Swiss guards, stoic and impassive, watching her pass. And then she saw the floor. It was covered in chestnut shells, thousands of them. In the gray light, they looked jagged and sharp. Lucrezia stopped. Near the leg of a table, she saw a shadow. For a heartbeat, it looked like a woman in a blue dress, huddled on the floor, weeping. It looked like Fiammetta. Lucrezia blinked. The shadow resolved itself. It was just a pile of discarded velvet cloaks. Fiammetta and the other women had been ushered out hours ago, sent back to the streets with their bruises and their shame. But the ghost remained. Lucrezia could feel the phantom weight of Fiammetta's hand on her hem. She could hear the echo of that stifled sob. Lucrezia looked down at her feet. Directly in her path lay a single large chestnut shell. It was brown and hard, a remnant of the game that had turned human beings into animals. The old Lucrezia would have stepped around it. The old Lucrezia would have picked her way delicately through the debris, careful not to disturb the mess her father had made. The new Lucrezia did not step around it. She drew her foot back and kicked it. It skittered across the marble floor with a dry, hollow sound, clack, 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 until it hit the wall and vanished into the shadows. She looked up, her chin high. She looked at the sleeping Pope, slumped on his throne with wine stains on his chest. She looked at the silent, watchful Cesare. "I am still here," she whispered. The words were barely audible, lost in the vast, vaulted ceiling of the room. But to Lucrezia, they sounded like a thunderclap. "You took my body," she thought, the words forming a mantra in her mind as she walked toward the heavy oak doors. "You took my pride, you took my name, but you did not take me." She pushed the doors open. The guard stepped aside to let her pass. Lucrezia Borgia stepped out of the room, leaving the chestnuts, the wine, and the men behind her. She walked into the corridor, where the air was cool and empty. And for the first time in her life, she did not look back. Time, the great leveler, eventually came for the monsters. It did not come with the swift mercy of a sword, but with the slow, rotting inevitability of decay. 2 years after that night in the Vatican, Pope Alexander VI lay dying. The man who had treated God's law as a suggestion died foaming at the mouth, his body swelling so grotesquely in the summer heat that he could barely be fitted into his coffin. The invincible Cesare Borgia, the predator who had made all of Italy tremble, followed him into the abyss a few years later. He did not die a prince. He died alone in a skirmish in Spain, his body stripped naked by looters and left to the wolves. The machine they had built to consume the world had malfunctioned. It had devoured them instead. But far to the north, in the misty, river-bound city of Ferrara, the renewable resource they had traded away was still breathing. Lucrezia Borgia was no longer the girl with the hollow eyes. She was the Duchess of Ferrara. The people did not call her a whore, nor a witch, nor a pawn. They called her La Bona Duchessa, the Good Duchess. She sat in council with poets and philosophers. She managed the city's grain supplies during famines. She drained the marshes to prevent malaria. Yet beneath the heavy brocade of her ducal gowns, she wore a secret. Against her skin, scratching at the soft flesh with every movement, was a Silas, a shirt made of coarse animal hair. It was an instrument of penance. Some whispered she wore it for the sins of her family. But Lucrezia knew the truth. She wore the pain because she chose it. In a life where every violation had been forced upon her, this small, private stinging was the only pain that belonged to her, alone. It was a reminder that she was still alive, still feeling, still in control. It was a bitter winter evening in 1519. Snow dusted the rooftops of Ferrara, turning the city into a sketch of charcoal and chalk. Lucrezia walked through the halls of the Ospedale di Santa Anna, a hospice she had founded for the poor. The air here smelled of lye soap and sickness, a sharp contrast to the perfumed rot of the Vatican. Her ladies-in-waiting trailed behind her, wrinkling their noses, but Lucrezia moved with purpose. She stopped at a cot in the corner. Lying there was a young woman, perhaps no older than 18. She had been found in a ditch near the city walls, beaten half to death by a soldier who had refused to pay for her services. Her face was swollen, her lips split, but it was her knees that caught Lucrezia's attention. They were scraped raw, bloody and bruised from crawling in the dirt. Lucrezia froze. The years peeled back. For a second she wasn't in a hospice. She was in the Sala dei Santi. She saw the chestnut shells. She heard the laughter of the cardinals. The girl on the cot opened her eyes. They were dark, terrified, and swimming with pain. They were the eyes of Fiammetta. "Water!" the girl croaked, shrinking back as she saw the Duchess looming over her in gold and velvet. She expected a blow. She expected to be kicked aside like refuse. Lucrezia did not turn away. She did not freeze. "Bring me warm water and a cloth," she ordered her ladies. Her voice was steel. "Your Grace," one of the ladies whispered, scandalized. "Let the nuns handle it. She is unclean." "I said," Lucrezia turned, her gray eyes flashing with a terrifying fire, "bring me the water." When the basin arrived, Lucrezia knelt. She ruined her silk gown on the dirty floor without a second thought. She dipped the cloth into the water and began to gently wipe the blood from the girl's bruised knees. Her hands, once cold as ice in the papal chapel, were steady and warm. The girl watched her, trembling. She looked at the jewels around Lucrezia's neck, then at the gentle hands cleaning her wounds. It made no sense. The world didn't work this way. "Why?" the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "You are a duchess. I am nothing. Why would you do this for me?" Lucrezia paused. The cloth hovered over a particularly deep cut. She looked at the girl, really looked at her, and saw the ghost of the woman she had failed 18 years ago. She saw the hand reaching out for a hem that had been pulled away. "Because I remember," Lucrezia said softly. The memory of the Vatican faded, replaced by the reality of the hospice. "Because once, on a floor made of marble, I saw a woman fall, and I did not help her. I let her crawl because I was afraid." She squeezed the water from the cloth, the red droplets falling into the basin. "I cannot save her," Lucrezia said, her voice shaking with a sudden, fierce emotion. "She is gone, but I can save you, and in saving you, perhaps I save the part of myself that died that night." The girl didn't fully understand, but she gripped Lucrezia's hand. This time, Lucrezia did not pull away. She held on. Later that night, back in the ducal palace, a fire roared in the hearth. The castle was decorated for Christmas. On a silver platter near the fire sat a bowl of roasted chestnuts. They were hot, their shells cracked open to reveal the sweetmeat inside. Lucrezia stood by the fire. She was 39 years old. Her body was tired from 8 pregnancies, from the hair shirt, from the weight of history. But her spirit was clear. She reached out and picked up a chestnut. She remembered the sound they made hitting the floor. She remembered the humiliation. But that was in Rome. That was in the past. Here, in the life she had built from the ashes, a chestnut was just a nut. She peeled the shell. She put the meat in her mouth and chewed. It was sweet. It tasted of winter and fire and survival. Lucrezia Borgia smiled. It wasn't the vacant smile of a bride, nor the cruel smile of her father. It was a sad smile, etched with lines of grief, but it was hers. "I won," she whispered to the empty room. The monsters were dead. The victim had become the savior, and the butterfly, against all odds, had survived the wolves. Lucrezia Borgia's journey from a pawn in the Vatican to the good Duchess of Ferrara teaches us a powerful lesson about the human spirit. We cannot always control the cruelty inflicted upon us, nor can we erase the scars of our past. However, true power lies not in the position we hold, but in the choice we make to survive. Like Lucrezia, you may face moments where you feel stripped of your dignity or voice. But remember, your trauma is what happened to you. It is not who you are. You have the power to take the broken pieces of your history and build a fortress of kindness and strength. You can choose to be defined not by the darkness you endured, but by the light you choose to become. If this story of resilience and truth touched your heart, please like this video and share it with others. By doing so, you help us pull more forgotten voices out of the shadows of history. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter of the truth. May God grant you the strength to walk through your darkest valleys with your head held high. May He give you the grace to heal from wounds that no one else can see, and the courage to turn your pain into a shield that protects others. May you always remember that no matter what the world takes from you, your soul belongs only to you and to Him. If you believe in the power of rising again, write Amen in the comments to claim this strength today.